Tropical Medicine. I welcome Professor Kadambari, who is going to moderate the session. Before I hand over the session to Professor Kadambari, who will formally introduce the speaker, I would like to request that all participants keep their microphones muted throughout the talk and post their questions and comments in the chat box, which we will compile and take up at the end of the presentation once Dr. Ahmed Rashid concludes his talk. Now, without further delay, I would like to hand over the proceedings to Professor Kadambari, who will provide a formal introduction to the speaker. Welcome you, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Dinesh. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce Professor Mohammad Ahmed Rashid, a very good friend of mine and a colleague whom I've known for the last almost 8 to 10 years. And he is currently employed as a professor of medical education and pro-director of education at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And prior to this, occupying this distinguished position, he had a brilliant academic career in the field of medical practice as a GP and also in medical education, where in his position as Professor of Medical Education and the Vice Dean of the Faculty of Medical Sciences at the University College London, which is where I met him in 2018. He continues to serve at the UCL Medical School as an honorary professor. He has also fulfilled several pivotal roles, such as being a chief examiner with the GMC and as an external examiner with many external universities. He has a postgraduate certificate in medical education, and he also has a Doctor of Medicine by Research in medical education. And the focus of his research has been on this extremely important yet ignored topic of globalization. And this journey began with the thesis of his MD, where he studied global approaches in medical school regulation. And I've read almost all his publications, and they range from topics like accreditation, regulation policies, international partnerships, and most recently, a very thorny topic of politics of medical education, which he co-authored with Professor Janet Graham. So primarily, his work has questioned the dominance of one side of the globe in deciding policy and practice across borders. And that has built the case for contextual designing of medical curricula, accreditation, and regulation. Apart from this extensive work in medical education, Professor Ahmed Rashid has not ignored his primary responsibility in general as a general practice expert, and he has mentored a huge number of students and postgraduates in that primary discipline. And he's worked on areas such as maternal health and morbidity, equity in healthcare, and mental health. These are his primary areas of interest as a GP. So we are extremely privileged to have you address us today, Ahmed, and we look forward to listening to you on this topic of globalization of medical education standards. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Professor Kadambari, for that very warm and generous introduction. I feel very humbled by your words. Very grateful to you for the invitation. And I'm very grateful to all of you for taking the time after what I'm sure has been a very busy day for you all to listen to this webinar. Thank you for doing that. I'll just share my screen and then we'll begin. Please let me know if you can see the screen.
Yes, it's visible.
Fantastic. Okay. So again, huge thanks to the organizers of the event, Professor Kadambari and your colleagues for inviting me. As you've just heard, I'm going to be talking about globalization. Particularly, I'm going to be talking about global approaches to regulation in medical education. And the one question that I want you to keep in your minds throughout this talk is who wins? And I'm going to hopefully revisit the question of who wins later in the presentation, and I want you to maybe give me the answer to that question of who wins when we come back to it towards the end, once you've heard the argument that I set out. So before we begin, I just want to maybe set some context. You've just heard those very generous remarks from Professor Kadambari about who I am. I work, as you see from the slide, at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So this is a public health university based in central London. You can see that we are focused on improving health and health equity, both in the UK and worldwide. And just to say that although we're based in London, we are a very global university. So we have a campus in Uganda, in East Africa, which is supported by the Medical Research Council UK. And we also have a campus in West Africa, in the Gambia. And in both of those two African campuses, we have several hundred researchers working on various topics related to public health, infectious diseases, and really a whole variety of research programs that go on there. Of course, I don't believe in university rankings. I think they're a complete scam, and there are many shortcomings to university rankings. But of course, we live in a world where they matter. Unfortunately for LSHTM, we are performing particularly well on them. So we are ranked first in the UK and first in Europe for public health, and second in the world according to the current rankings. We're very fortunate to have a huge number of leading global health figures who have been alumni from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So the current Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, and I think something like 20 ministers of health around the world are alumni from LSHTM. So we're very proud of the impact that our former students have had in their careers around the world. And we continue to keep a network of alumni, and it's a really important part of what we do here in London. Okay, so that's a little bit about LSHTM very briefly, but I really want to give you a further indication of my perspective before we move into this topic, because immediately when you talk about globalization, people are interested in your own perspective. What's your take on globalization, and why is it that you have come to form the opinions that you have? As you've heard from Professor Kadambari, some of my recent publications and recent research has been on topics related to globalization. And I think the key message I want to give you is that I had no pre-existing interest in globalization other than a series of events. And if you like, I accidentally became involved in developing an interest in globalization. So when I was a medical student and a junior doctor, really I had no interest in globalization or global health. My only focus was really on being the best possible doctor that I can. As you've heard, I'm a general practitioner, so that's a family doctor, and I work with a very deprived population in an urban kind of practice here in the UK. And really, that was the primary focus of my career. And it was really only through becoming involved in medical education that I began to understand some of the issues of globalization. And that's because some of the roles that I've, again, it's kind of fortuitously, you might say, or accidentally, held have related to topics of international and global matters. So my previous role at UCL, I was director of a Center for International Medical Education. As Vice Dean of the UCL Faculty of Medical Sciences, I also led on international partnerships. And I also held a role with our Royal College of Family Doctors. So the RCGP is the UK Royal College, which is tasked with handling the curriculum and assessment as related to family medicine in the UK. And I was the international medical director of that Royal College for a term. And it was through those roles that I began to become interested in globalization, primarily because I had the opportunity to interface with people working in medical education all around the world. And that was a great privilege and a great honor. And it really allowed me to understand the differences that we experience as those involved in medical education around the world. Of course, much is the same. much of medical education is the same around the world, but what's different is the way that we see the priorities. And a really clear, concrete example for me about the differences was this organization, the World Federation for Medical Education. And the reason that this was such a clear example for me was that in the UK, having worked in several medical schools, having worked in undergraduate education, postgraduate education, and CPD, having worked, as I say, in a variety of different settings, I had never come across the World Federation for Medical Education. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what it stood for. And currently, I serve as my institution's representative on the Medical Schools Council. So this is an organization of the deans of UK medical schools. So there are about 40 medical schools in the UK, and we regularly meet to discuss issues of medical education. And never have we discussed WFME, never has it come up. And I imagine if I was to ask the fellow deans of medical schools in the UK if they knew what WFME stood for or what it did, I'm sure that they wouldn't know. And I found that quite fascinating that we have an organization that, in my context in the UK, was virtually unheard of and had absolutely no relevance. But when I went to some of the countries around the world showed on this map, there was a real preoccupation with the World Federation for Medical Education. It came up in lots of meetings and it was discussed widely. And that was really fascinating to me. Why should it be the case that there's an organization that has world in the title, and yet it wasn't universal around the world that we came in terms of importance, in terms of relevance, in terms of where it was coming up in discussion and conversation. So this prompted me to do some exploration. Who was this organization? Why is it that other countries in the world are preoccupied with and so interested in this organization, and yet my colleagues in the UK have not heard of it? And when I came to look at the most senior body, the decision-making body of the World Federation, which is known as the Executive Council, I was quite interested in the makeup, in the membership of this decision-making council. So firstly, there are 6 regional associations for medical education. So these are associations that represent medical education in one particular part of the world, in Europe, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and so on. So each of these are giving a voice to their particular part of the world. And that seems very reasonable that we should have regional associations discussing issues on a global level to give a voice to their own regional priorities. There are also 2 founding members. That's the World Health Organization and the World Medical Assembly. And these founding members are there because of the very close link between medical education and the healthcare sector. So again, that makes sense to me. We might have representation at the World Federation for Medical Education by healthcare related global agencies. And then there were 4 executive members, which is where I want to just give some focus. The first 2 executive members are the International Federation for Medical Students Association. So this is a global agency which represents the voice of medical students from around the world, and the Junior Doctors Network. So again, this is a global agency that represents the voice of of junior doctors from all around the world. So far, we have 10 members of the Executive Council. 6 of them are representing a particular part of the world. 2 of them are representing the medical profession and the healthcare sector more broadly on a global level. And 2 are representing particular constituencies that have a vested interest in medical education on a global level. So those are for medical students and junior doctors. Now, I don't know how you're seeing this table, this power table, if you like, of the world, but in my view, it kind of makes sense. I can understand why each of them are there from a democratic perspective. I can understand that each have something to bring to this forum. But it isn't made up of 10 members. Actually, it's made up of 12 members. And it's the last 2 of those members that I would just like to give you a kind of a provocation, if you like, about. And the first of those is the ECFMG. So the ECFMG is the Education Commission for Foreign Medical Graduates. I'll talk more about them in a minute, but they are basically a US agency. But US is already covered because we've got those 6 regions of the world and each of them are already covered. So why do they have an extra position on this table? And the last one is AMI, and you'll know that AMI is Association for Medical Education in Europe, and they are an executive member. But Europe is already covered because the first of those 6 regional associations is ASME, which is the Association for Societies of Medical Education in Europe. Uh, and therefore, we have a double representation, if you like. So we have Europe, which gets 2 seats at this table, and we have ECFMG, an American agency from the USA, which has a position in a World Federation of Medical Education Council on the body, on the executive body, on the executive council. And this, when I saw this, it kind of struck me as problematic. If we are to say that this organization is genuinely a global agency that is democratic and that is equally represented from around the world, then why should it be that Europeans or North Americans have more of a say than others? Why should it be that they have an additional position around this table? Why not India? Why not China? Why not Nigeria? Why not any other country in the world from the south to have an additional seat at this table? Why should it be that the Europeans and the Americans have an additional seat at this table? And I think that's particularly interesting to me as somebody who is based in Europe. And as I said to you in my previous slide, actually, this organization is particularly irrelevant and particularly not well known in the UK. And therefore, it's particularly striking that there should be this power imbalance on the Executive Council. And it's the first of those 2 executive members that I've highlighted as problematic, the ECFMG, that I just want to spend some more time talking about. So this is a US agency that has an executive position on the WFME Council. So an agency from my country, from the UK, or from your country in India doesn't have this privilege. So why did this particular agency have this unique privilege? So just to remind anyone or remind people that haven't come across it recently, or to enlighten those who haven't come across the ECFMG before, they are, according to the US Department of Education, the authorized credential evaluation and guidance agency for non-US physicians and graduates of non-US medical schools who seek to practice in the US or apply for a residency program in the US. So in other words, if one of my medical students or junior doctors in the UK, or one of your medical students or junior doctors from India wants to go and do their residency training in the US, they need to pass through the ECFMG. They need to be recognized by the ECFMG, certified by the ECFMG in order to apply for that residency program. Now, why are the ECFMG of interest to me, and why are they of relevance on this executive council? The reason is because of a decision that took place 15 years ago in July 2010. Because in that moment, in July 2010, they took a decision that would have profound consequences, not just on the US, the country where they're based, but a profound influence on the entire world of medical education. Because the decision they took in July 2010 was that from 2023 onwards, any physician applying for ECFMG certification, in other words, to migrate to the US, will have to be a graduate from a medical school that has been appropriately accredited. So that is that the medical school of the applicant must be accredited through a formal process such as those put forward by the World Federation for Medical Education. Now, this was really interesting because if you track the history of WFME, which was established in 1972, actually it had very little influence. It had very little activity, very little influence, and was probably not discussed I don't know because I wasn't there, but I feel confident that it wasn't as widely discussed, or it wasn't a preoccupation with the world's medical schools in the way it has been in the last decade. And the reason in 2010 that the WFME was infused with this power that made it of relevance and interest to these medical schools around the world is this ruling. In other words, the fact that the US made this decision, that the process that WFME puts forward becomes necessary in order for graduates from that country or from those medical schools to be able to practice or to gain residency training in the US. And just to be really clear, when you are certified by ECFMG as a doctor, you still have to pass the USMLE and you still have to do your residency training in the US. So this is not saying that this ruling around accreditation is not about kind of safeguarding in the sense that these doctors are immediately going to be allowed to practice in the US. There are still hurdles that these doctors will have to pass subsequently to the certification by the ECFMG. So just to be really clear about that. So this decision that they took in July 2010, as I said, had profound consequences and long-standing consequences around the world. And I would liken this decision that they took to the butterfly effect. So some of you may be familiar with the butterfly effect. So this was described in 1972. You can see this paper, which is, does the flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil set off a tornado in Texas? In other words, the butterfly flapping his wings, it's a seemingly tiny act, but the consequence of it is an enormous seismic effect, a tornado, which happens hundreds or thousands of miles away. And I think this is very much like what happened with the ECFMG ruling. It seems like a very small ruling, a relatively minor decision that they've taken, but actually, although it's the flap of a butterfly's wing for the ECFMG sat in their offices in the US, actually it's had a tornado effect on the rest of the world. And the reason it's had a tornado effect is because, as a direct result of the ECFMG ruling, the World Federation for Medical Education, who before this were relatively obscure, they hadn't been, they didn't come up widely, the activity was really fairly limited, suddenly became very important and relevant for medical educators around the world. And as a direct result of this ruling, the World Federation for Medical Education teamed up with FAMA, and FAMA is as part of the same company that ECFMG is part of, so it's a US agency again, to develop proposals for a recognition program for accreditation, for accrediting agencies. So just to summarize, it was a US decision taken in the US to set up a global system, and the organization who established the program on behalf of the World Federation was also a US agency. So this is a US policy decision followed by implementation with a US agency. But the World Federation for Medical Education is not a US agency. It's got world in the title. This is a global agency for the whole world. And as a result of this ECFMG ruling, the World Federation for Medical Education has now been established for well over a decade. And this program does not accredit individual medical schools. Rather, what it does is to recognize accreditation agencies. And so far, I just checked this morning, 53 agencies have been accredited. And bearing in mind that there are around 120 agencies or more that accredit medical schools, that means that in the last 15 years since this policy was announced, less than half of the world's agencies have signed up, have complied with that mandate that was set in 2010. And here's the really interesting bit. This WFME program is no longer linked to the ECFMG ruling. If you look on the website, for most of the last 10 years, the WFME website had very clearly laid out that this WFME recognition program enabled compliance with the ECFMG ruling. However, that has now been removed from the WFME website. And the reason that's been removed from the WFME website is because the ECFMG are no longer implementing the program in the way that they described in 2010. We're nearly in 2026. This was supposed to happen in 2023. It didn't happen in 2023. At first, it was delayed till 2024 because of COVID. And then when 2024 eventually arrived, they decided not to implement this policy in the way that they'd originally described. And WFME have therefore, changed their narrative on this, and they're no longer linking this recognition program to the ECFMG accreditation ruling. So, where are we with this? Number one, from my perspective, this I go back to, I won't go all the way back to the slide, but I want to take you back to the slide that I showed you with the various countries and medical schools and other medical education agencies that I've worked with around the world. And I've met some really outstanding medical education leaders who are really doing brilliant work trying to do the best for their medical students, for their residents, but they have become preoccupied with the World Federation for Medical Education. And the the consequence of that has been that they've often had to completely change their country's own priorities, the resources that they're spending. They've had to change a huge amount to comply with this new WFME recognition program. And as it happens, the reason that they did that, which was to comply with this ruling from the US, has now become void. It's no longer happening anyway. So they did all this work, they spent all this money, and actually they needn't have bothered, because actually the reason they were doing it has not materialized. And for me, seeing the huge impact firsthand, and firstly, there's the impact on the individual medical educators. There's the impact on their medical schools, the number of curricula that have changed, the number of assessments that have changed, a huge amount of that has changed as a result of this. Not to mention the fact that the WFME recognition program has generated millions of dollars of revenue for the World Federation, and there's no transparency about where that money has gone. What has all this produced? Was this worth doing? What has that single flap of the butterfly's wings in the US done to the rest of the world? Who's captured this? Who's evaluated this? Who's measured this? And the answer, I'm afraid, is that we don't see that. Because if you go into PubMed and if you type in World Health Organization into PubMed, you'll see every year there are over 100,000 publications about the World Health Organization. Why? Because there's a recognition that this is a powerful global agency, and the academic community, the medical community, the global health community have a duty to hold it to account and to critically evaluate what the World Health Organization is doing. If you type in World Federation for Medical Education into PubMed, you'll find a tiny, tiny number of publications. So is it not the case that the community of medical educators around the world should hold to account WFME in the way that those in global health and other fields hold the World Health Organization to account? Should it not be the case that we should be asking questions when millions of dollars have changed hands? And by the way, some of those countries that have paid money to be recognized are very low and middle income countries. So they're countries that don't necessarily have a huge amount of resources. Is it not incumbent on us in medical education to critically examine, yes, this has all happened in the last 15 years, but what has been the effect of it, and what have we learned from it? What can we learn from it? And if there's one message from my webinar today, I think it's really for us to ask questions when we see these practices going on, because globalization is not inevitable. It's not the case that we just accept that globalization will happen in one particular form, but rather there are opportunities for us to ask questions of what the effects are of policies that may be masked or that may be presented to us under the guise of globalization. So I'm going to present to you just findings from a few papers that look at WFME and that have appeared in the literature in the last few years. And these are in an attempt to answer some of the questions that I'm trying to lay out to you, which is how can we think about this in a way that allows us to critically examine globalization and its effects. So the first of those studies that I want to talk to you about is an analysis of how the World Federation and the ECFMG came to make an argument that this recognition program was required. So this was an analysis of all the policy documents from 2010, from the years leading up to 2010, and from the years following 2010, because that was when the butterfly flapped its wings. It's really examining that point in time to say, how were these ideas presented? How was it that these policies, that this accreditation policy and this recognition program was allowed to come into existence? And there were two central arguments that were presented to enable these policy decisions. The first was altruism, and the second was nationalism. And the first of those is, as the first argument is around altruism. So altruism was an argument to say that these policies, whether it's from the ECFMG or the World Federation, are about being altruistic. In other words, helping the world, improving the standard of medical education around the world. And the second set of arguments was around nationalism, that these policies were about protection and they were about control. They were about ultimately protecting the American public from international doctors. Okay, so there are two parallel sets of arguments that are being presented to us here to say, why did all this money get spent on a recognition program? Why did we have a ruling from the US about where people can go to medical school and how those medical schools should be accredited? So just to give you a sense of the altruistic argument, so this is from Dr. Pinsky, who is the president of the ECFMG, not currently, but previously, who said that the ECFMG's policy around accreditation was talking about that policy and said that the ultimate beneficiaries are, of course, the world's patients who will receive better healthcare as this initiative moves forward. So this is an altruistic argument. We're doing this as the US to help the world's patients who are going to get better healthcare as a result of this initiative. Now, I just want you to pause for a moment as medical educators and think about whether any medical education policy can be demonstrated to result in better healthcare for patients. I want you to just think about the many, many steps that would have to be demonstrated in order for an initiative, and not least in regulation, but in any part of education, to have an impact on better healthcare around the world. We know, I'm sure that you will be familiar with the arguments and with the literature around the gap that exists between being able to demonstrate those things. But nonetheless, I'm not interested in the moment at examining whether the claim is credible or not. For now, I just want you to focus on the argument, the purpose of the argument. And the purpose of the argument here is to say, we're doing all this accreditation business to help the world, particularly to help provide better healthcare to patients around the world. But in parallel, that's the altruism argument. But in parallel, as I said, there's another argument, which is about nationalism. And this argument is demonstrated through this quote, which is, greater accountability is warranted to assure the American public that their physicians are well trained. In other words, this parallel argument is not about better healthcare in Africa or Asia or South America or Europe or anywhere else. This is about protecting the American public. And I just want you to think for a moment about who might be the intended audience of these two different arguments. So I want you to put yourself in the position of these American policymakers or these World Federation policymakers. And I want you to think about who you might be trying to convince with each of these arguments. So if you're making the argument of altruism, in other words, you're making an argument to say, we're doing this in order to make the world a better place, to make particularly medical education and healthcare a better place, who might you be trying to win over with that argument? And who might you be trying to win over with the nationalism argument? Who might you be trying to convince by saying that the American public should be protected from the harm that could come to them from doctors trained overseas? And I also want you to consider whether it's possible to have both of those arguments. Is it possible to implement and to introduce an initiative and argue concurrently, simultaneously, that it's altruistic and nationalistic? Is it possible, in other words, to make those two arguments together? Does that hold water? Not for me or for anyone else, but for you. How do you feel about those two arguments being held together? Now, look, one just to kind of draw this to a conclusion, I think it's really clear in my mind that any country in the world, any sovereign nation in the world, has the right to introduce any policy that it wishes. So India can introduce any policy it wishes, the UK can introduce any policy it wishes, the US, any country in the world can do whichever policy they believe is best for themselves. But I just want you to focus here on the role of the World Federation for Medical Education, because the objective of the World Federation to Medical Education is to enhance the quality of medical education worldwide with promotion of the highest scientific and ethical standards in medical education. Now, let's take the first argument, altruism. If we take the argument of altruism that was presented in these policy documents that were analyzed, then does that align with the WFME's mission? Yes, it does. WFME's mission is to improve medical education worldwide. And this argument says that these accreditation policies are about making medical education better around the world. That's fine. But if we take the second policy argument, which is around nationalism, is there any way in which a global agency that sets its objective as enhancing quality of medical education around the world could adopt a policy that was nationalistic for a single country? And what I mean by that is, what if we chose a different country? What if we chose China? What if we chose Zimbabwe? What if we chose Argentina? What if we chose Kazakhstan? What if we chose Japan? And what if the World Federation for Medical Education adopted a policy where the policy argument was about protecting the people in the public in any of those countries? Do you think that would be possible? Do you think that would be implemented? And if not, then why is it the case that this was implemented? Because it was with the US. Okay, so just moving on to the second of those papers that I introduced to you. This was examining the WFME recognition program at 10 years. So this was a paper that examined the first decade of the recognition program. And the first thing it noted is that there has been no formal or informal evaluation of the program at all. Now that's interesting. Why? Because of the huge impacts and consequences that it's had. You know, we are, I'm sure that all of you will be familiar with the principles of evidence-based healthcare and with public health, that any intervention should be evaluated in order to examine, are there positive consequences? Are there negative consequences? Do the positive outweigh the negative? Are there unintended consequences that we hadn't anticipated? There are lots and lots of reasons why we should evaluate any intervention that we do, particularly in an intervention that has the huge global impact that this one has. But that hasn't happened. There's been no evaluation. And by that, I don't mean, I mean there's been no evaluation presented at all. Neither an internal evaluation that the World Federation may conduct themselves, or what we should really want is an external evaluation, an independent evaluation, a team of researchers coming from the outside and saying, hang on, What this has been running for this number of years. It's generated this $1 million. What has been the consequences of it? Where all those claims were made that this was going to be altruistic and improve medical education and healthcare around the world. Let's see if there any of those claims hold up. It doesn't exist. I've already told you, most agencies have not applied. So there are well over 120 agencies that accredit medical schools. Not even half of those have yet applied. And agency motivations are not always clear. So some of the agencies that have applied, it's not really clear why they've applied. So for example, some of the agencies one of the agencies that's applied has accredits medical schools in the US. So it's not entirely clear why they should apply, why they should have applied, and there has been no uh, information that's been provided about motivations at all. What's also clear is that a global market for accreditation has emerged. So, although you might imagine that there would be one accreditation agency in each country, and that accreditation agency regulates all the medical schools in its country. So that's the model that we have in the UK. We have a General Medical Council, and it regulates medical schools in the UK. That's the kind of dominant model. But what we've seen emerge in the last decade, particularly, is that some agencies are now operating in multiple different countries. So an agency from Kazakhstan is accrediting medical schools in the Caribbean. And the accreditation agency in Turkey is accrediting medical school in several different countries. So we see that there's a marketplace that's emerged. And it's fairly clear that this has emerged as a result of what's happened with this recognition program. And yet there's been no understanding of why that's happened, no evaluation of why that's happened. And I imagine that most of us on this call might think it's slightly bizarre that an agency might accredit a medical school thousands of miles away when it has a completely different context. And finally, there's very little transparency and no research. So it's if you would like to find out information about which agencies have applied, you can't find that. You can find which ones have been approved but not applied. In other words, you can't find out which agencies have applied and not been recognized, for example. So there's lots of information that I think would be reasonable for the medical education community to be able to access that is not accessible because there's quite a lot of secrecy around this recognition program, which I think is problematic. And finally, the third of those three papers, just to briefly touch on, is really questioning what should a global agency for medical education look like. The World Federation for Medical Education has been around for 53 years. And in those 53 years, it's had 6 presidents. All of them have been white men. Yep. Most of the world's medical schools are in Asia, are in Africa. They're not in Europe and in America. But yet, why is it that they have not been appointed to the senior roles in this organization? If this agency is genuinely representing the world of medical education, when I go around the world and see people working in medical education, most of them aren't white men. And yet those are the figures that have been presiding over this agency. The offices of this agency have been in the US and the UK. And if you look at the policies, and again, if you want to read more about this, I'm very happy to share in full the reference and the link for you to read this paper. But what it clearly lays out is that over the course of that 50 years, what has this global agency done? It's legitimized Westernization. It's supported the priorities of countries like North America, and you've just heard me explain a very specific example of that. And it's lacked transparency and democracy and evaluation. And in the world, in 2025, where most sectors, most industries demand transparency, demand democracy, demand transparency, why is it that we don't have that and we are not even asking for that in medical education? So I began my talk by asking you this very simple question: who wins? And now it's for you to decide for yourself, and I hope we'll have a discussion about who wins when we globalize medical education regulation. Do countries like India win? Or is it actually the same small group of countries that win when we apparently globalize our approach to this area? And just to touch on a few final points before we open up for discussion, Professor Gardenbury mentioned this paper, which is really examining all the phenomena that I've just described in the framework of politics. So this is a paper which really provides a political lens to understanding these decisions. And I've just given you a brief snippet from this paper, which is that if the global medical education community is to realize the mission of creating a flatter and fairer world, it's incumbent on leaders in both the North and South to consider how the very political ideas and tools that have created the conditions for this domination can be used to support those in the South to resist and thrive. And then just the final paper to mention is one that actually I had the enormous privilege and honor of co-authoring with Professor Gardenbury, and this was in the journal BMJ Global Health. And this examines this phenomenon through the lens of decolonizing global regulation. And we know, for example, that completing postgraduate training in North America is desirable. And we know that doctors can charge more in their private practice if they've completed training in North America. And we know that limiting opportunities for students of medicine is problematic for this reason. And therefore, in many parts of the world, there's a fear that by being outside of the bubble, that they may miss out or fall behind some sort of global standard, which will limit opportunities and create problems for graduates. And this is an alternative model that's set out in that paper. So just as there are increasing calls for cultures in the global south to reimagine imported views of education to suit their own context, we might envisage and reimagine ways of actually supporting medical education in any context to enhance what it does to serve the local community, profession, and the development of healthcare. And those ways might be, and this is the most important bit, local rather than global, contextual rather than general, cooperative rather than hierarchical, supportive rather than judgmental, flexible rather than rigid, and developmental rather than a single snapshot. So, to put that more simply, the alternative model is to reject globalization, to reject a global approach to regulation, because those models do not create the conditions for some countries to thrive. And rather, the people who win are the same old people, the same old countries. And just as a very final point before we open up for discussion, I just want to, I mean, I've used the terms global north and global south, and I imagine you are all familiar with this concept of global north and global south, which is derived from trade and from economics, but has been widely used in many different disciplines. And I just want to maybe introduce you to an idea, or maybe some of you may have come across it before, but the earliest world maps, or some of the earliest world maps, existed in a theological way. So some of the earliest world maps were created by churches certainly in Western Europe. And this is an example of one of those, which is the Mappa Mundi. So Mappa Mundi, literally, Mappa means cloth and Mundi means world. So this is a cloth which demonstrates the understanding of a global map as it was when this was produced, which was about 700 years ago. So in 700 years ago, in Western Europe, this was the world map. And this was the understanding of how the world was configured. And as you can see, North is not Europe in this map. It's actually India. And the reason for that is because at that time, in Christianity, the understanding was that heaven was located in the east, and therefore they depicted India, because that was the country that they understood as being in the east, as the northernmost point of the map, the point that contained heaven. And I just wanted to finish with that as a reminder that this map that we've all accepted as being the kind of truth, which places Europe right in the center and right at the top, is not inevitable or automatic. That is not the only way of looking at the world. We do, we This is a map that we have all internalized and we've all accepted, but actually is not the only way of seeing the world. So I think one of the most important messages for me around globalization is rejecting the status quo, rejecting the idea that there is only one way to look at the world. And that is a way in which Europe and North America dominate and the rest of the world falls below an arbitrary line. If we go back to the map of 700 years ago, perhaps we can see that there are other ways of looking at the world. There are other ways of understanding globalization and geopolitics. And I'll stop there, but would be delighted to take part in a discussion or answer any questions. Thank you so much for listening.
I thank.
Yeah. Please go ahead, Dr. Dinesh.
Yes, ma'am. I thank Professor Ahmed Rashid for the illuminating session. To be frank, this is a topic which is relatively new for most of our audience, and I am very extremely elated to have a discussion on this topic. Let's now proceed to the discussion and followed by question and answer session. I request the audience to please type their questions in the chat box and we will be attending the questions in a serial manner. Over to you, ma'am.
Yep. So thank you, Ahmed. That was a brilliantly argued and dissected, dissection of WFME and its role in the current scenario in accreditation. So it's actually discussing with you and Professor Janet has what turned this whole thing for me as well, and kind of it was a very educative experience when we had the session with 2 years ago in the UCL, where we had the nominal group meeting. So I just have, before opening it out, I have just one. I read one of your papers where you had talked about the hyper-globalistic, the skeptical, and the transformative phases of globalization. So there was one question I had when I read that paper, and you talk about the third phase being a transformational phase. So you had given a couple of examples. Could you elaborate on that and tell us how you visualize this to be a transformational experience of phase of globalization?
Sure. Thank you so much for the question. So just to maybe outline for anyone who hasn't come across that this is a notion of how globalization thinking has evolved historically over time, and it really gives a framework for thinking about responses to globalization. So one set of responses is known as a hyper-globalist response. And a hyper-globalist response is really one which kind of uncritically accepts globalization and exaggerates the benefits of globalization perhaps in a naive way. So in other words, it creates a story around globalization which really emphasizes most heavily on the possibilities and opportunities that globalization presents. So, for example, it brought with it in the medical education context, and by the way, these these ideas are not from medical education, but have, have I think some of them do apply. The hyperglobist response in medical education is one which presents, for example, the idea that we could achieve a universal medical curriculum. And these ideas were particularly prominent in the late 90s and early 2000s. The medical education literature was kind of full of optimism for that notion that we could somehow create a hyper globalist reality in medical education. What would that look like? It would look like a universal curriculum for medical schools. Other ideas were, for example, around professionalism. So the idea that we could create a professionalism framework that captured all of the different medical professional cultures around the world. So that hyperglobalist is an exaggeration of the positive. The skeptical, which is the second category, relates to, if you like, the opposite, which is an emphasis on negative consequences or on challenges of globalization. And in a sense, that rejects globalization and says that we should really move to think only about medical education in a local way. And any ideas of moving educational ideas or concepts is problematic, and also brings with it politics and brings with it other uh, kind of geopolitical challenges that create harm. So the third grouping is transformationalist, and this is a notion that we can be engaged in some ideas that promote globalization, but that we do so in a balanced way, and therefore accept some of the positive and see some of the benefits that might come, for example, with exchanging ideas between different nations or cultures, but that we must keep that skeptical voice, and that we must be able to reject ideas if they are problematic and if they don't apply in different contexts. So I think the framework really is one that emphasizes, I think the most important part of the framework is emphasizing that as human beings, we do have a tendency to be hyper globalist. In other words, to exaggerate the importance of globalization without really trying to or being able to understand the negative consequences. So I think to apply that here, what we might see is that in a way, the WFME recognition program is hyper globalist in that it gives a notion that there could be a single approach to regulating the world's medical schools. That is a hyper globalist idea. And in a sense, what we can see is that this policy decision from the ECFMG in 2010 was at a time when actually in societies around the world, that very positive notion of globalization had already faded away because that idea was really prominent in the early 2000s. And therefore, even before this recognition program came into existence, we'd moved away from hyperglobalization. And this program was stuck in a worldview that had disappeared already at that time. And this is one of the issues when you set up a policy that is not that in its wording is not designed to be implemented 13 years ahead. How is it that we could possibly design something now for 13 years ahead, given the way the rapid evolution of thinking around the world, especially on a topic as kind of divisive and as contentious as globalization. So I think that how I would apply that framework here is really just to emphasize that uncritical adoption of globalization, which we can call hyper-globalist, was a product of its time in the late 90s and early 2000s. The WFME recognition program was made in that worldview, and in the time since then, the whole world has moved on, and the thinking of the world has moved on, which is why, interestingly, that policy was never implemented in the way it was originally described. And maybe that's why we look at the recognition program and say this just doesn't make sense in the world that we're living in because it was designed in a different frame of thinking. I don't know, if, Professor Kadambari, if that answers the question.
Absolutely. And as you said, I mean, it really doesn't make sense when you look at it. And I think you've raised all the right questions here. And I think the final question that you ask, who wins, has, I mean, triggered a lot of thought. As we can see in the chat box, there have been, I think you have stunned everybody into silence in a way, because the arguments are so powerful. There really is, there's nothing to really question in what you have said.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm Nanda Kishore. Dr. Rashid, first of all, I'm a colleague of Dr. Kadambari at JIPMA, Pondicherry. First of all, congratulations for a very scholarly talk that dealt with this rather difficult topic. Would I be wrong if I argued that a lot of globalization or the attempts to globalize are driven by market forces? Now, I would say it's aspirational to study in the West for students coming from Asia, Africa, or some of these countries, but it's not so aspirational to study as it is to work in the West eventually. So people from India or other countries who want to go and do their residence in the US are doing that not because they want to get trained in the US, but they want to get an opportunity to work in the US. For example, that's an example. So would I be wrong to argue that a lot of this is driven by the market forces? It's a better life there, it's a better earning position there, and that is what is pushing it, rather than the actual needs of a given community?
That's a brilliant question. Thank you so much for engaging with it. And I think you wouldn't be wrong. In fact, I think you would be absolutely right that market forces are absolutely central here. Again, coming back to the question of who wins here? But if we create a system by which the entire world is operating in a way that suits one country, then surely that country wins. Surely that the winning is for the whole world to be producing graduates for you. That's one way of looking at this, which is the entire world is producing graduates for you because you require that labor, and labor is related to market, exactly as you say. So I think you're absolutely right to think in those terms. I think anytime we see any policy, we should question what are the benefits for different parties from that policy. The benefit for one country might be that this policy means that the graduates that we will be taking as our market, as our labor, as our workforce, are being trained in a way we want them to be trained. You can train them for us, and here's the way in which that you can do that in a way that suits us. On the other hand, if you look at it from the other direction, the countries whose doctors are leaving to go to another country, what the result, the effect for that country is that they have a loss of workforce, and that they are, even for the graduates who are staying in their country, they're not being trained in a framework that suits that country. So I think that's exactly that's one way of looking at it. The effect of two different countries. One is that they have a lot of benefit, and that the other one has a lot less benefit. And that's exactly how the market works, as you say. So I wouldn't say you're wrong at all to make that argument. I think that argument has a lot of merit.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it explains a lot.
Amit, there is a comment from Dr. Niraymati.
I would like to ask one important question which has been asked in the chat box, sir. So, if we reject the globalization of medical education, how can we maintain high and consistent standards within the local training systems?
So that's an excellent question. And I think what I was trying to deal with in the one of those papers that I presented to you about decolonizing the regulation system is exactly that. What is the alternative? What's the alternative system by which we can do exactly as has been described in the chat, which is to maintain high standards within a local training system? And the argument that is set out in that paper, which I'm happy to share with you, is prioritizing what matters to that education system and that workforce requirement. So, in other words, rather than focusing on another country, so the problem with the term globalization is that it gives a sense of it being a global standard. But in reality, it's not a global standard. Actually, the standard is from another country. So it's the priority or the standard coming from North America or coming from Western Europe or from anywhere else. There is no global standard. All there is a standard of a country that you choose to accept as being a global benchmark. That is the truth of globalization, that it's a mask, if you like, to allow the domination of a certain framework or a certain system. Now, if you choose to make another country your benchmark, that's fine. As I said in my talk, the criticism is not of any country making any single decision. Any country or any system can decide what it thinks is the right thing. The issue becomes when we take the priorities of one country and systematically make it a problem or make it a requirement for other countries, which is where I think the recognition program does. So, in answer to your question, how do we maintain high and consistent standards? Well, you focus on prioritizing what matters for those and by developing the systems that fit that. And there are ways of doing that either within a country or within a region, because what's more likely to be relevant to a country like Zimbabwe? Is it more likely that it's going to be relevant what's happening in North America or what's happening in the country next door, in South Africa or in another neighboring country? So rather than focusing on this notion that the world can be one, actually prioritizing either individual nations or regions of the world. So there's some fantastic work, for example, going on in Southeast Asia, where a group of countries are creating a model where they, if you like, they peer review one another because they are they're geographically close, culturally similar. They have similar societies, issues, training programs. They're able to develop a system by which they can benchmark with one another and drive quality and drive regulation in a way that is regional rather than global. So I think the answer is to find whatever works. And by the way, there's no problem with identifying a country further away and saying that that is a country that you want to emulate in some specific way if that fits your context. That's fine, but that's not globalization in the sense of the whole world develops one framework and we follow that. Rather, it's saying, actually, in my local context, this particular idea is helpful for me and it does transfer for me because of all the analysis that I've done, all the thinking that I've done. I think that this can help me to maintain those local training standards.
Thank you, sir. So,
Dr.
Dr.
Ananthakrishnan,
yes, sir.
yeah.
Please, sir. Over to you, sir.
Can I say something?
Absolutely.
Yes,
Please
sir.
go
Yes,
ahead.
sir. You're right. Yes, please.
Yes, thank you, Kadambari and others. I must say that it's one of the best talks that I've heard in the recent past. And I must congratulate Dr. Rashid for keeping the facts so clearly in front of all of us. Facts that we know, but choose to ignore because of this call for globalization and so on and so forth, which are things thrown at us when we object to these things. My friends in the audience here, Kadambari, Gitanjali, Nandakishore, Lata, and others, Mahalakshmi and others will know, I've also been a very harsh critique of the regulatory actions which are disconnected with what is required in the field. You will be surprised that the regulatory agencies which are supposed to govern regulation and supposed to consist of senior educators often do things which on the face of it destroys education altogether. And I have written about this in many forums, and the last paper I wrote was who will regulate the regulators in the latest issue of National Medical Journal of India. But that's not the relevance. The relevance is I question the need for or the relevance of globalization because given the cognitive load of the curriculum has to be relevant to the country where it is preparing doctors to work. I don't think that we have the time or the students have the ability to digest a curriculum which will be globally relevant, keeping in mind the different socioeconomic conditions, the different attitudes to medicine, and the different diseases that they are going to face with. Because my son recently wrote a paper in JAMA which said, "Where are you from?" He said this question is often thrown at Indians who are there as if they are from an inferior nation. Where are you from? Are you able to understand English? And so on and so forth. Things that they feel that others are not fit to work in their countries. But coming back to the regulatory agencies, in my mind, the medical education in India has been destroyed by the National Medical Commission and the Medical Council of India as well. And I'm surprised there are so many senior educators who are flag bearers for CBME who have never looked at all these 3 volumes of CBME with 2,886 competencies listed in them and seen or said in any forum, how can a student be taught or digest this 3,000 competencies? Many of them are not competencies, of course. And just as the NMC has destroyed the quality of education by mindlessly raising numbers without considering the consequences of that, the quality of healthcare has been destroyed by the accreditation agencies, which you mentioned in passing, by bringing in criteria which are not relevant. And you know what it brings, it breeds corruption and focus on ranking. So just to make a brief point, the flap of the butterfly's wing should start here and raise a storm where it counts in the headquarters of the WFME or in the ECFMG or the American Medical Association or wherever there are people who talk about bringing about quality of education in other countries without knowing really the ground levels and the difficulties that they are working with. So I hope Dr. Rashid's talk will make us flap wings, and must say I expect people like Gitanjali who are in positions of authority to raise these things instead of keeping quiet and accepting everything that the regulator says. Thank you, Dr. Rashid. You have opened my eyes to many things that have really clarified a lot of my thought. And I
Thank you.
want to
Thank you so
point
much.
out, I met Janet in Lucknow recently last year, and she said one thing which caught my imagination. She said, your engineers are able to work anywhere and everywhere in the world. Have you ever asked yourself why your doctors are not welcome? And I have no answers, and all the senior educationists in Lucknow could not dare to get up and answer her in front of an audience. So we have to first ask ourselves these things before we blindly say we want to globalize. Globalization doesn't mean improving quality. I must say that the term is not for quality of education. It has nothing to do with quality. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kadambri.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those comments. Just on your last point, I couldn't agree with you more. Do we really believe that these exchanges of millions of dollars and these signing of documents has any impact on quality I completely agree with you. I can't see, and I know I'm pressing them to say, show me the evidence, show me the research, show me the evaluation to link this to quality. Otherwise, there's no link to quality at all. And until they can demonstrate that, we should be holding them to account to say, what you've made a promise that this is about quality. Show me the evidence that that's the case. Otherwise, stop making the claim. You can't make a claim without providing evidence. And just to say, I'd love to read your paper, by the way, if you know about holding the regulators, who regulates the regulators. It sounds like a brilliant paper. I'd love to read that. I think you're right that it needs to be the solution needs to be in India, it needs to be for India, and it needs to be by India. And that's the only solution.
And it
The
has to be by people who understand India.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And on the CBME, I just an observation, if you don't mind, which is that oftentimes I mentioned that, you know, the time of thinking about um, globalization in a hyper-globalist way was in the early 2000s, and WFME came along 10 years later, too late to an idea. It's often the same with CBME or with lots of other ideas that they're generated at one time, and then by the time they've gone out of fashion, another country starts to use them. And the one that comes to mind for me, only because we've written about it recently, is PBL, problem-based learning, which, you know, emerged in North America in the 1970s and decades later was being implemented around the world. By that time, most of the countries in Europe or the US who had started to use problem-based learning had stopped because the fashion had come and it had gone. And the fashion arrived in many countries decades later. And I think that's really interesting observation about the timing of these
People
fashions.
that competency-based medical education is not just a phrase. It has to involve, if competencies are fixed, time should be variable. So you cannot have a competency-based system for every one of your students and keep the time also constant. That such a system can never work when students are of different levels of motivation, different levels of application, and so on and so forth. And if we are going to say that we are going to do it for a batch of 250, you're talking absolute nonsense.
Completely agree. And my point about the fashions was really that there was a time at which CBME was a very fashionable thing to talk about in some countries, and now those countries have moved on and said, actually, maybe it isn't such a good idea. You know, so
We always lag behind, so it's fashionable here now. Everybody in education talks about CBME from 2019 as if it has made a world of difference. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question, please?
Please,
Please go ahead.
Yeah,
please,
okay.
ma'am. It's our pleasure.
Dr. Rashid, first of all, congratulations. I thoroughly enjoyed your talk. Though I am not that unfamiliar with the some of the arguments you have put, but for me, I mean, the way you presented it really opened my eyes. So thank you very much. What I want to say is there seems to be a subtle, what shall I say, objection when we try to write papers or anything which is going against the current thinking. For example, right now in India, they want everyone to praise the CBME, whatever is going on. At the most, even if they want to criticize, there is a kind of a very, what shall I say, a very half-hearted criticism which comes. But what I'm seeing is that even journals don't want us to, very strongly criticize things which are going against the current thinking. And I find that very difficult to take because journals are supposed to be unbiased. And if we can provide proper evidence, if our arguments are well argued and logical, and the referees don't have anything bad to say, they should accept. But it's not happening. And I know Kadambari and we've had tried to publish some papers which have been not accepted actually, and we've had to go from journal to journal to just try to present some of the things because it's against what is being accepted. That is one. The second thing is there are some serious problems with the so-called curriculum, the CBME curriculum, which the National Medical Commission has put forth in 2019. And if you point that out, the journals are having referees who belong to the NMC or that kind of group, and they are simply not accepting. And even if we show them the proof, they don't want to see what's right in front of their nose. So this is another problem, which is because, see, I would like to publish articles like Professor Ananthakrishnan wrote in NMJI, National Medical Journal of India. If we publish in Indian journals, it makes sense because our readership is people from India. So this is another kind of thing. It's very difficult to see, but it's there. It's out there. And I think somewhere we have to start talking about this, where they're trying to silence the voices of dissent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gitanjali. I think that's an excellent question, and I face it myself as well. So I share exactly what you're saying. I guess a few reflections from me. One is, what is the role of the academic and scientific community? In other words, what is our role as academic members of staff, as faculty members? And there are whole books that have been written on this and on what we should be doing, but the central idea is for us to advance knowledge through opposition, through critique. That is the role of the academic community. So we have to provide opposition because that is our function. So I think, of course, I completely accept everything that you've said. The entire scientific publishing system is problematic in lots of different ways. The editorship and the reviewership and the peer review system is entirely politically driven. I think we have to understand that in political terms. And everything you've said is exactly right. So the truth is then that we have to be tactical. We have to think tactically about how we can present our arguments. And that means thinking about what are the right outlets, what are the outlets that are prepared to publish the work that we want to share, and what are the ways in which we can point out these critiques in ways that are varied. So there's of course there's a very direct argument that one can make in setting out one's ideas, but then there are also ways to generate evidence that helps to promote your ideas. So that means collecting information, collecting evidence, collecting data, and presenting your arguments in ways that are difficult to argue with. And that means by using the rules of whatever that publisher is or whatever the journal is, and by adopting as best we can the kind of rules and laws by which those different platforms are judged. And I think that that's the way that we have to approach this, is to think about how we can share these important messages in the ways that we can. And it may be that sometimes the perfect place that you would really like to publish something is not possible for the reasons that you've outlined. For example, that the politics of the journal or the editor or some other society stops that from being the case. And in those scenarios, I think what we need to do is to find other platforms, find other ways of publishing the ideas and the critiques and the work that we do around that. And then it doesn't have to be the case in the traditional way that we present work in a journal and the readers of that journal access it. The world's completely changed in terms of how we share information now, whether that's by publishing in other places and then sharing those articles directly through emails, through networks, through social media, and lots of other ways. So I think we have to find a way to share these ideas and not shy away from our role as members of the academic community, which is to critique, which is to challenge. We have a duty, I believe, to do that. And in terms of dissemination, I think we have to be tactical. I think we have to be creative and find a way to get those arguments out. But completely accept that it's not straightforward, and that this is a real struggle. And if you have good ideas, then I'd love to hear them, because as you can imagine, I share this challenge myself in terms of finding who are the people that are willing to publish this and are willing to give a microphone to people that have an idea that may not be one that fits with the mainstream.
Thank you.
Now, there aren't any further. Are there any further questions? Would anyone like
Any more
to
questions?
unmute and ask anything of Professor Rashid? Okay.
Okay.
Dinesh, would you like to?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. I will give the concluding remarks. Yes.
Yeah.
On behalf of our entire organizing team, I thank and extend our gratitude to Professor Ahmed Rashid for this amazing session on an eye-opening topic. Indeed, the session was very helpful for us. And my personal take-home message from this topic is the educations need to be, rather than moving towards the global standards, it should be relevant, local, and contextual, sir. Thank you for the session. I also thank our Professor Kadambari for her excellent moderation. I thank the entire technical team of the Department of Medical Education, JIPMER, Department of Telemedicine, JIPMER, for providing the coverage, for arranging for the session, and audio-visual aids required for the today's session. And at last, I thank the audience, especially we had an audience of distinguished medical educators from India and across the globe, whose presence and enthusiasm made this webinar a huge success. Thank you once again, sir.
No, thank you. And Ahmed, we'll look forward to welcoming you at JIPMER in April for Medicon and learn much more from your experience and from your expertise. Thank you very much. And good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.